Welcome to the CHCH Newsmakers podcast. I'm your host, Rick Zamperin. If it is making news in Hamilton, Halton, and Niagara, across this country, or around the world, I'll be tackling it here on Newsmakers. The start of the new school year is here, and so it's the perfect time to take stock of our education system. How's it performing? Where are the shortcomings? And are there parts of it that we should be celebrating? Joining us today is Annie Kidder, the Executive Director at People for Education, an independent charitable organization working to support and advance public education through research, policy, and public engagement. Annie, thanks for joining the podcast.
I'm very happy to be here.
When you think about Ontario's education system, the good, the bad, everything in between, what comes to mind?
Well, I actually think right now, what I'm thinking about, and what I think we wish more people were thinking about, is all of the headlines about everything else that actually aren't about the education system. So if we think about trade wars and Trump and democracy and, how's Canada doing and how are we the whole idea of elbows up, all of that, climate change, all of the things we're facing, I feel like we should be thinking, and how is that connected to public education? And how do we make sure that our schools are, producing, maybe the wrong word, too hard ass, but the next generations we need. So I don't think it's as simple as going, are our schools good or bad, or especially in terms of how we've been thinking about them for the last sort of 100 years. It's more, what are we doing to make sure our schools are preparing kids for this incredibly messy, rapidly changing future. And right now, I think we get very caught up in sort of short-term arguments about very specific things, and that we've been missing in Ontario and across the country, because now we're looking across the country, a kind of opportunity to go, what's our big long-term vision? If this is the reality of the world, or if these are all the unknowns in the world, what should we or could we be doing in our schools? So for me now, it's like, how do we get at that? How do we get to a different conversation rather than that kind of polarized bad, good, right, wrong fights that we've tended to have in public education in Ontario and across the country?
We're going to be talking about a very ambitious yet amazing vision that People for Education has. It's called the Education Promise. But before we get there, is there an appetite for a major overhaul when it comes to the education system in this country?
Oh, what a mean question. Because I'm not sure there is, to be honest. But our worry is that without that, we're missing an opportunity. So one of the reasons there may not be an appetite for that is school systems in Ontario, schools, boards, the system itself, and across the country are under an incredible amount of stress. So what you hear, every day, or we will start hearing again the minute schools start, is about staff shortages and violence in school and kids who are really struggling with their mental health. So there's a lot of stress in the system. So there is a resistance to people like us going, and it should change. And part of our theory is we need to do a better job convincing the rest of the world, people who don't have kids in schools or aren't directly connected to schools, to go, there's an opportunity there, again, for the kind of future of Canada. But no, there's not, to be brutally honest, there isn't a huge appetite for let's change everything. There's not a huge call for that, but there are a ton of people outside and inside the education system who are positive, based on evidence, that there are things that we could be doing differently and that we should be doing differently in order to, build public education into all of our plans for Canada's future. I was just at a meeting yesterday in Ottawa with all of these big leaders from around the country thinking about our kind of economic and social goals as a country, and about how public education needed to fit into that. So it's no big appetite, but also a big need.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the education system. This is not, there's no federal education ministry. This is, each provincial and territorial government in charge constitutionally, responsible for, making sure that they administer the education curriculum in an appropriate manner. My guess is the provinces don't want to touch this right now, or do they?
No, I don't think they do. I'm making it sound like it was doomed from the start. I think that they are, so let's take provincial elections as an example. There's been a bunch of them over the last couple of years. Education hasn't been an issue in any of them, except for very narrow kind of issues like gender, stuff like that people thought would make sort of good political hay. But again, even for provinces, we're going, you're missing a possibility here. So no, provinces aren't going, yippee, we should be doing this. You're really right about the kind of the structure we have in Canada, where constitutionally provinces and territories are absolutely in charge of public education, and they do not want the federal government meddling that, and nor are we suggesting anything like that. It makes it really hard because, and Canada's unlike nearly all other countries in that way. We have no way of talking to each other across the country. We're not learning from each other across the country. We're not going, cool, you're doing that in BC. Maybe we should try that in Ontario or New Brunswick. Or here's this amazing program. There is really cool stuff going on in the Yukon, in Nova Scotia, but we don't necessarily know about it. We don't necessarily learn from it. And we're not using it as a way to kind of push the education system forward. So no, everybody's kind of in emergency mode right now. They're thinking about what can we do this week, and especially about the economy, basically. And it's hard to find it's not hard, but not impossible to find the people who are thinking about the long game, to go, actually, we need a much more, a longer term, more sustainable strategy than just, do we retaliate on tariffs or not? Or, what do we throw money at right now in order to deal with the messy world that we're in? And for us, it's like, that's fine, do your elbows up things, but also how are we thinking beyond that? So there are people outside of governments wanting to talk about this, really thinking about this and going, we need a change. But right now, and again, it was such a mean question. No, there's not an appetite in provincial or territorial governments, and there's not a huge outcry there in the world going, public education should change. But when you start asking people, do they want to be a part of a conversation about public education's role in what our future should look like, they actually get really excited and go, yeah, cool, I would like to be part of that conversation. So we're trying to we're not seeing this as a response to an emergency, because it's not the one that naturally comes to mind, but we are seeing it as a longer-term response to where we are as a province and as a country.
We're going to get into the education promise by those behind it with the People for Education. Our guest today on the CHCH Newsmakers podcast is Annie Kidder, the executive director. When it comes to students and Canadian students, how do they fare against others in other countries? Are we holding our own?
They fare pretty well. Yeah. And I think that's one of the other, we sort of think, we're going to hell in a handcart. We're not. If we look at just test scores in reading, writing, and math and science, international test scores, Canada's always in the top 10 among, all the OECD countries. The scores go up and down. Everybody's worried kids are doing worse at math. They're doing worse at math all around the world in terms of those scores. So, and Canada does pretty well also in terms of the impact of this kid's socioeconomic status on their success in school. So our kind of equity gap in Canada is smaller than it is in some other countries. So Canada's public education is good. We're arguing it could be great, but it is good. And I think that that's the other thing to sort of remind ourselves of, that we have this incredible asset in Canada, and we are rare and becoming rarer in that the vast majority of our kids go to public schools. So more than 90% and way more than about 95% in Ontario of our kids go to public schools. So we've got this fabulous opportunity that's working pretty well. It's under a lot of stress right now, and you know, what could we be doing with it? So it's not to say, to your point about Canadian students are doing terribly and something needs to change. That's not necessarily the issue. Certainly things could be better. There's always room for improvement in those narrow areas. But what are all the other areas that we want to make sure that we're looking at, thinking about, reporting on, that we're really truly prepare kids for the future? I'll give you a very, kind of small example. Mm-hmm. A while ago, I can't remember when, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, in Ontario, the government said, we're going to teach kids coding in kindergarten. And it's like, and you go, well, that ship has already sailed, because nobody needs to learn coding because AI already does it for you. So again, it goes to not thinking about some immediate, sexy sounding idea. It's like it has to be about the long game. And then in terms of how Canadian students are doing, it's like, how well are we preparing Canadian students to live and thrive in the world? Obviously, that's a lot harder thing to measure, but that is what we have to be looking at in Canada right now, and looking at how equitably are we preparing them in that way.
One last question before we take the deep dive into the education promise is, when it comes to, improving the school system, why do it now? Are we nearing a point of no return?
What a scary question.
I'm sorry.
I feel like, are we nearing a point of no return in so many ways?
Yeah.
But I think it's a good question, because there is a kind of, you don't know what you got till it's gone problem. Mm-hmm. I think in Canada, we kind of take public education for granted. We go, well, it's been there. It's been there since before Confederation. We've had public education. It was an incredibly important part of the founding, quote unquote, of Canada as it looks now. And it is important to know that in other countries, public education and the support for public education and the system itself has really been eroded. And in some countries where we wouldn't think of it, like Sweden, for instance. But if you look at the United States, for example, where they had very strong public education and a strong commitment to it since the founding of the United States, it's really broken apart now. There is not the same proportion of kids that go to public schools. We don't have there's not the same assumption there as there is here, that everybody most people go to public schools, rich, poor, wherever you live. That's kind of the assumed choice. So I'm not, pulling the fire alarm right this minute, but I think we do have to be mindful of how easy it is to lose things, again, in this big, messy world. And I'm not talking about how we better watch out because there's a secret conspiracy to privatize everything. But I think more we better watch out because things are breaking apart in various parts of the world. And we have to look at, what are our great assets? How do we keep them strong? How do we make sure that they're changing in ways that are needed? And how do we do both things at once, I guess? I mean, if you think about Ontario or any provinces right now, people working in schools they are having a hard time. They are struggling in many different ways. How do we address those, short-ish term issues and the long-term ones too? We have been saying in Ontario since the pandemic, and the pandemic is a really important sort of piece in this. We've been saying about Ontario, but it's true for other provinces and territories, that there should be a task force or a big partnership table with everybody at it, thinking about okay, it's 2025. What is our vision for public education? What do we need to be doing? What do we need to be doing differently? And we need everybody at the table, teachers, principals, deans of education, Indigenous leaders, students, parents, all of the different people who work in schools, experts on health. We need them all at the table to be able to kind of reframe what we're trying to do. And I worry that right now, what we have instead in Ontario and in other provinces is kind of headline making stories about education that aren't really getting at that fundamental, what are we trying to do anyway?
Mm-hmm.
In Ontario, we're arguing about various things. In Alberta, they're arguing about different things, but they're very, very specific. And they're not necessarily getting at what's the job of schools? What's the purpose? What do we want them to be doing? How are we assessing their kind of long-term strength and health? Yeah, so it's that as much as anything. Sorry, that's a very long, vague.
That was a great answer. Great answer. So let's get to the education promise. I know there's several planks in it. What is it? What does it aim to do?
That's like it's the end of summer vacation. Okay, I think it goes to it's sort of what we're saying is that Canada has never needed strong public education more than it does now, and part of the now is there's a kind of Trump USA part of the now that makes that true, but another part of the now is the rapid change, this kind of unknown future, the fact that kids who are starting kindergarten next week are going to end up working in jobs that don't exist, like more than half of the jobs that they'll be looking at when they graduate don't even exist right now. So we're in this kind of moment. We're in a moment of polarization. People flooded with misinformation, a Canada that's like trying to figure out how do we be resilient in the face of the kind of storm facing us. So for us, thing one of the education promise is that we need public education, and we need to make sure that it's responding well to all of this. The other parts of this are that there are two big issues that have to do with the fact that up to now, education has been really kind of isolated from everything around it. So it talks to itself, talks to itself very well and with lots of good intention, but it's not necessarily talking to people who are working on other things like health or the environment or democracy or the economy. So it has that problem, that silo problem. And then it has the problem of Canada, which you brought up at the beginning, which is that when the Constitution was written, education was absolutely divided out as a provincial territorial jurisdiction and has stayed that way. And forever, ministers and ministries of education have guarded that jurisdictional power, and they do not want the federal government interfering. Even in the pandemic, when the federal government went, here, would you like some money for education? Provinces and territories went, yeah, sure, we'd like the money, but we don't want any strings attached because this is our jurisdiction. What that's meant is what I said before, which is that we're not talking to each other, we're not learning from each other, and we're not having conversations about possibilities for change. So we've got, the need for public education. We've got the problem of the kind of silo of education in the world, and then we've got the problem of Canada. And so for us, the part of the answer is bringing more people into the conversation. So we've been talking to people who are working on environmental and climate issues. We've been talking to lots of people in health. And by health, I'm talking about physical and mental health and well-being in every way you can think about flourishing. We've been talking to people who are thinking about democracy and polarization and misinformation and media, and talking to people who are thinking about jobs and the economy and productivity, all the kind of headline items right now, and asking them, do you want to be part of a conversation about a kind of new pan-Canadian action plan for education? And again, we're not saying the federal government should run education, or there should be one education for everybody because all provinces and territories are different. But we are saying it's time for a Canadian conversation about this, in order to, again, build support for some, yeah, new. I'm not even sure they're new for change in the system. And we're not saying we need to invent anything new. Actually, there are fabulous examples of schools, of teachers, of boards, of provinces doing really cool stuff. How can we make that happen in more places? What can we learn from that? So we had our first summit in June, where we brought people together from across the country, including, importantly, young people, and went, okay, we're setting up these 4 working tables in those 4 areas: health, democracy, economy, and environment. Put people together at those tables, experts in those sectors along with experts in education, and started the process of going, what could be a vision in this area, what are the barriers to getting there, what are the opportunities that already exist, and what kinds of recommendations do we need to be coming out with. So that was the beginning of the process, and that process we're just sort of putting together all of the findings from the first working tables. We're going to take that on the road over the course of the year to come up with a draft pan-Canadian education action plan, bring people together again, and then start to look at, okay, where are the most important areas that we need to be looking at? So if you think about teacher education, for instance, are there things that need to change in terms of teacher education so that teachers feel more prepared to be teaching kids in this big, messy world? How do we think about, for years, we've had conversations about schools as community hubs. There are, in some provinces, examples of policy that supports that to happen. What can we learn from that? What does it mean? And I know this can sound kind of big and and a lot, because it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's the opposite of the conversation about money, which often in education, oddly, we end up always getting to. It's like there just needs to be more money.
Mm-hmm.
And again, right now, schools across the country are under a lot of stress, and sometimes the call is there's not enough money. We don't have enough funding, or funding has been cut. But if we just stay stuck in the money conversation, we're never going to get to the what are we trying to do conversation. And to us, it's like we have to start with that. What do we want to do? What's our vision? What are the key areas we need to be working on? And then what is the funding necessary in order to do that? And it is big and it is a lot, but again, there's a possibility in Canada to do this work, and there's a bit of an appetite in the outside of education, where some people are going, ooh, if we're thinking about, to just put this really, really narrowly, and some people get sometimes upset if you talk about education and jobs, but jobs are real, and when your kids grow up, you really care if they have jobs. So people thinking about employment, productivity, prosperity, inclusive prosperity, yeah, for a long, long time only thought about post-secondary education, or they only thought about, young people once they were grown up. And you have to think farther upstream. And we're not saying you should be preparing kids to, work in whatever industry when they're in grade 5. It's not about that, but it is about what are the kind of foundational skills and competencies that are needed to be able to, manage AI. So it's not managing you, to be able to work in, again, I just saw there's a university where you can actually take courses now in it's not how to be, but in being an influencer. Like, what does that mean? And I'm very old, so I just go, that's a job, but it is a job.
Yeah.
And again, there are so many jobs that don't exist right now, and it's not to prepare kids for those individual jobs. Again, the mistake of going, everybody needs to learn coding because too late, like that ship has sailed. What are the things underneath that? So if we think of how everybody kind of needs to be an entrepreneur in today's world. Well, the skills underneath that have to do with collaboration and relationship building and being able to critical thinking in terms of being able to like think of an idea, worry away at it, try it out, get feedback, go in, change it again, understand what works, what doesn't, so that it's preparing kids for the world in that way. So it's not about saying yeah, kids should know what they want to be when they grow up when they're 15 because they don't, and training them for that. But it is about looking at the world as it is now and trying to ensure that we we're building the possibility for a kind of better, stronger future, one where all kids feel, have the capacity, have the sense of agency so that they feel they have a voice in their communities, so that they're not feeling that sort of sense of disconnection that just makes them mad at everybody in terms of the polarization, so that they feel that it's possible to be engaged. They have all of those kinds of skills that are necessary to do that. And I think that that's the change that's going to be needed.
I think I read on the website that this is a 5-year initiative where you're going to be, talking with stakeholders, holding these summits, getting feedback from individuals in and outside of the education system. At the end of that 5 years, what is going to be, is there going to be one major difference, you think, or one major new thing that's going to take our education from good to great?
Well, I think it's weird because one of the new things is that we are in our vision, there will be some kind of Canadian network infrastructure. There'll be a place where we can do this work, learning from each other, keeping track. We are in the process right now of developing an annual Canadian school survey. So as you may know, in Ontario for 25 years, we ran the annual Ontario School Survey. And it was a survey that went to all the principals in the province and just asked them very, kind of plain old questions about resources and programs in their schools. And it was a way of keeping track of the impact of policy and funding changes on schools and being able to kind of tell the story, kind of open the door into schools because they're a bit of a mystery to all of us. So we have been working with principals councils across the country to develop an annual Canadian school survey. So we will then be able to every year talk about what's going really, really well. What's the difference between Nova Scotia and Manitoba in terms of special education or in terms of technology in schools? So that will be one thing that will exist. There also will be clear policy recommendations, kind of calls to action. That will be recommendations for different levels of government or different kinds of systems. So coming to agreement. And we're trying to make sure that we're bringing people together. So it's not just an echo chamber, bring everybody together and they all go, oh, we're so clever and we all agree with each other. We know everything, which happens really a lot. Trying to bring people together who don't agree on everything, but find consensus on the things that they are sure would work and make a difference. I'll give an example. We want to understand more about British Columbia that really shifted its education to move to focus on core competencies. Which means that in some schools in BC, they integrate a whole bunch of subjects together. So they're not dividing things into subjects. And most of the work is working on a sort of project-based, product-based way across subjects. And kids are learning math and they're learning reading and writing and they're learning facts, but they're also learning all of those other competencies that are so necessary right now in the world. They're learning to investigate, they're learning to problem solve, they're learning to work when they disagree agree with each other. They're learning to fail and to try again. Some of them are learning to, make their own businesses or design games or whatever. So what can we learn from that? And is there something that we should be thinking about across the country in terms of that kind of shift? There's also really cool stuff going on in other countries in Europe that also we might learn from. So the goal is that there will be a pan-Canadian action plan that's had input from people from across sectors, from experts, from people who work inside and outside schools. There'll be an annual Canadian school survey that's reporting every year on programs and resources in schools, so we have an idea of how the country is doing in that way. And there will be a way for people to talk to each other and learn from each other that will be permanent in Canada. And right now we have a Council of Ministers of Education of Canada. It's constrained by, again, by the Constitution. So it's constrained by the fact that it's got about 23 ministers in it, because it's all the ministries of education, post-secondary and K-12 in Canada. And they can't really do anything except when there's consensus. So all of them have to agree before they can put out any recommendations or, put out any public reports. And as you can imagine, that is very rare. So it's important to have something that's outside the system, but working with the system, and especially working with a real strong belief in public education. So we're not it's not to attack the system. It's not to, be critical of the system, but it's also not to be namby-pamby about it. It's like, it does have to change. It does need, we who have worked in education for many years need to do a better job talking to the outside world about why this is important to all of us. And it has to make the links with the big issues facing us. And for us, it's like, what kind of country or province or community do you want to live in? And if that's the case, what's the role of public education in that? But we are going to try and get that to very, very concrete places. And again, so what might that mean to teacher education? What might that mean to different parts of curriculum? What might that mean to infrastructure, or to, how we think about a vast array of policies that might support change in education.
There are so many tentacles to this. Number one, I want to applaud you and everyone at the People of Education, everybody who is involved in this process, a very ambitious process, but 5 years from now, I think we'll be in a better place, at least to getting the ball moving to a better system. Annie, thank you so much for the time. Wonderful conversation, as always, and enjoy the start of the school year.
Yay, thank you very, very much. And I'm so glad you're doing this and talking about it. It's very important.
Absolutely. That is Annie Kidder, the Executive Director with the People for Education. And that's it for the Newsmakers podcast. Thanks for checking us out, as always. And a big thank you to the all-star cast behind the scenes. If you liked today's episode, click the thumbs up, hit subscribe, leave a comment as well. Catch the Newsmakers podcast on chch.com/podcasts and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.